You learned about, or refreshed your memory about, the differences between popular sources of information and scholarly sources earlier in this module. There are also different types of information within each of those categories. We'll focus on the types of scholarly sources because they play a substantial role in research. I'm also assuming that you've learned a bit about the different types of primary sources from experience, and maybe in other classes. One way we can categorize popular sources is based on whether they're news or entertainment. Similarly, we can categorize scholarly sources according to whether they're empirical or non-empirical. The difference between empirical and non-empirical sources is that empirical sources include the details of a study, including the details about the method as well as the results. Non-empirical methods and sources review other work or present a theory based on logic. They may draw on empirical sources, but they don't detail the method of the related studies. If you happen to look up the word empirical, it might make the distinction a little confusing. In this case, we're using the term a little differently than these definitions might suggest, particularly if you use the definition from dictionary.com that's in the lower part of this slide. That version says, without using the scientific method. Why do I mention that? Because it's a reminder that sometimes we use words a little differently than we might expect, and even if we just consider the dictionary definitions, we might get a different idea of the meaning. Given that, it's important to refer back to the context a term is used and look at the definition in that area. Another way to categorize scholarly sources is based on whether they're primary or secondary, a distinction you may have heard about before. The idea is that a primary source is the original source. It's the first time the information is shared. A secondary source is one that relays information from that source, so to speak. If you've heard of a primary versus secondary source before, it might have been in the context of history or autobiographies. But in this case, we're referring to the original report of research results. In contrast, a secondary source interprets or reports on those findings. We could think of it as sort of being like the difference between corn on the cob, canned corn, and taco shells. If we consider the corn itself to be the primary source based on empirical data, the canned corn and the taco shells are a secondary source. A secondary source might not change the information from the primary source very much. Like the canned corn is not much of a change, but it could change it a great deal, like the taco shells. I can keep going with corn examples. I have an odd fascination with the uses of corn, but I think you get the idea. You might have already found yourself wondering what the difference is between empirical sources and primary sources, or between non-empirical and secondary. It's a great question. It's a little tricky. There are really two different ways of categorizing sources. In addition to focusing on different characteristics, we also tend to classify entire sources as either empirical or non-empirical, while the information within those sources is categorized as primary or secondary. For example, a journal article that reports on the method and results of a study is considered an empirical source. Within that article, the method and information about the results of the study are primary source information. Other parts of the article are secondary source information because they provide context for the study by referring to other studies and theories. That said, we do know that empirical sources will include primary source information. Not all primary sources are empirical, though, because a non-empirical source can present a new theory or idea for the first time. If that seems about as clear as mud, I hope it makes a little more sense after you look at the examples in the activity with this module. Okay, at this point you might also be wondering why it matters whether or not a source is empirical or primary. That's an important question to ask. We can start by noting that whether or not a source is empirical is important because it relates to the support for the claims and information contained in that source. Whether or not a source is primary is important because if it's a secondary source, the way the information is presented can be misleading, either because of the context or because of the way the primary source is interpreted. Those differences relate to a number of the questions for literacy, scientific literacy, you're learning about in this module. If we're asking about the supporting evidence for a claim, whether it's substantiated, then we'll need to consider non-empirical and secondary sources with a little bit more skepticism. All of the types of sources could reflect unwarranted assumptions, but they may be a little bit more challenging to identify in non-empirical and secondary sources. You probably get the idea I'm working with, but you might still be thinking about the fact that I mentioned that these categories are primarily used for scholarly sources. Maybe you don't envision yourself going to graduate school or having a job that involves a lot of scholarly sources. That doesn't mean it's less important to understand them for a few reasons. One is because the overall idea also applies to popular sources, so understanding this can help you be more savvy when you're evaluating all types of information. Another reason is because you might still want to refer back to the summaries of scholarly sources, called abstracts, when you question whether a claim in a popular press or popular culture is accurate. The activity in this module will walk you through how you can figure out what type of source you're looking at. For now, the goal is to understand the definitions, and hopefully they seem relatively easy to follow. An empirical source details a study, while a non-empirical doesn't. A primary source is the first time an idea is shared. A secondary source is not the original and often puts the information in different context or interprets it. The differences matter because the different types of sources include different sources of support for the information and the claims they contain. That's important to keep in mind because it influences the accuracy, so it helps guide our analysis when we question a claim.